In our first reading today, St. Paul talks to us about unity and the different ways that we are united. And one of the ways that we are united in our church is through faith. Faith not only with all of those who proclaim the same things that we do currently here on earth, but continuously with all of those who have preceded us throughout the ages. This teaching is presented to us even today through sacred scripture, through sacred tradition, and through the magisterium, which is the official teaching office of the church. Pope Benedict XVI has said when we interpret things, we should be using the hermeneutic of continuity, meaning that we should recognize what was previous should be used in order for us to understand what is presented to us today, that there is a continuation of that same faith, even though it may be expressed differently. And I think we should take a likewise or similar position when we approach those puzzling and confusing comments that have been publicized about Pope Francis and what he has said with civil unions. First, I would like to acknowledge that what he was said was not being said in any official capacity as Pope. That what he has said about civil unions is not part of the deposit of faith, and we are not required to follow it. Because contrary to what some secular media would suggest, the faith is not promulgated by private interview that is revealed and released to the public in a documentary. If that same information was not released in the official capacities and ways through the church documents, then we are not bound to follow it. It should be addressed simply as it is, the opinions of the person who declares it. We've seen something similar from Pope Benedict XVI when he was Pope. He wrote a few books called Jesus of Nazareth, but he made it clear that he was not doing so as Pope. He was doing it as a theologian, and that those were simply to be taken as his opinion. And so the same would be true with Pope Francis and his comments on civil unions. In this documentary, Francesco, which was released on Wednesday, Pope Francis is quoted as saying, "Homosexuals have a right to be a part of the family. They are children of God and have a right to a family. Nobody should be thrown out or be made miserable because of it." These words should be understood in their proper context, with other statements that he has made, as well as trying to understand the source of these words themselves. The Pope has previously spoken against adoption by same-sex couples, and he has said that it can harm children. In fact, he said, and I quote, that the children, and I quote, deprived of their human development given by a father and a mother and willed by God. He said that in regard to these adoptions. So he recognizes there can be harm done because of that, and so he is opposed to it. Yet the words that he said in the documentary would suggest that maybe he was in favor of it. It turns out that these words were actually from an interview from 2019, one in which these words were taken out of context. In fact, these three simple sentences were reordered, and they were taken from 3 paragraphs of that same interview. And in that interview, what he had actually said was, and I quote, "I was asked a question on a flight. After it made me mad for how one news outlet transmitted it, about the familial integration of people with homosexual orientation. And I said, homosexual people have a right to be in the family. People with homosexual orientation have a right to be in the family, and parents have the right to recognize that son as homosexual, that daughter as homosexual. Nobody should be thrown out of the family or be made miserable because of it." And then the next paragraph doesn't really include any of these lines from the documentary, so I'll skip that and go to the 3rd paragraph. "They asked me the same question another time, and I repeated it. They are children of God. They have a right to a family, and such. Another thing is, and I explained, I was wrong with that word, but I meant to say this. When you notice something strange, it's strange, or no, it's not strange, something that outside of the usual, that is, not to take a little word to annul the context. There, what I said is that they have a right to a family, and that doesn't mean to approve of homosexual acts? Not at all. In its proper context from the interview, we can see that he's not supporting adoption by homosexual couples. We can see he's not suggesting that they create their own family, but rather within the family that they are born, they should be accepted as people who are experiencing these attractions. This is consistent with the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which recognizes the dignity of the human person and that they too should be respected. And so in their proper context, we see what he meant is consistent with the teaching of the Church. The more difficult quote in the documentary is where it says, and I quote, "We have to create a civil union law. That way they are legally covered. I stood up for that." This is a little bit harder to understand. It's apparently in reference to his proposal to his brother bishops during 2010, where there was a debate in Argentina about allowing for same-sex marriages. And he was suggesting that maybe we can avoid same-sex marriages if we allow for some sort of civil unions. But the Pope has actually defended our understanding of marriage as it comes to us in sacred tradition, through Scripture, through the magisterium of the Church. The Pope has said, as Pope, and I quote, "Marriage is between a man and woman," end quote. He's also said, and I quote, "The family is threatened by growing efforts on the part of some to redefine the very institution of marriage," end quote. In regards to efforts being made to redefine marriage, he said, and I quote, "Efforts to redefine marriage threaten to disfigure God's plan for creation," end quote. And so the Pope seems to be standing up for marriage, but it's still confusing. What did he mean by civil unions then? Unfortunately, unlike the previous quote in the documentary, this quote about civil unions does not appear in that 2019 interview, or at least not its publicized official version. Yet it seems to be in line with and consistent with the other things that were said in that documentary and its presentation. And so the origin of that quote is unknown, but given that the first part, at least it was unknown to me as of last night, but given that the first thing that was quoted in that documentary was taken out of context, it would not surprise me if this too was taken out of context. We do know that the Pope has previously spoken out against civil unions as we understand what civil unions are. In 2013, in the book On Heaven and Earth, he referred to laws that are assimilating homosexual relationships in marriage and how they are, and I quote, "an anthropological regression," end quote. He also expressed that concerns of same-sex couples, and I quote, "are given adoption rights, there could be affected children. Every person needs a male father and a female mother that can help them shape their identity," end quote. Additionally, in his Apostolic Exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, in Articles 52 and 251, we hear from Pope Francis, and I quote, "We need to acknowledge the great variety of family situations that can offer a certain stability. But de facto or same-sex unions, for example, may not simply be equated with marriage. No union that is temporary or closed to the transmission of life can ensure the future of society." So he's saying that no such union can be helpful for society in that document. And the second quote from that document, "In discussing the dignity and mission of the family, the Synod Fathers observed that, as for proposals to place unions between homosexual persons on the same level as marriage, there are absolutely no grounds for considering homosexual unions to be in any way similar or even remotely analogous to God's plan for marriage and family," end quote. Since Pope Francis has repeatedly, as Pope, spoken out against homosexual acts and against civil unions, his most recent comments are very confusing. However, some have suggested that what he had said about civil unions is a mistranslation. Others have suggested that he meant something different than how we understand civil unions, that he meant something of giving legal privileges to those who are very close to each other, but not marriage, and excluding homosexual acts. It's really hard to understand what he meant since we cannot find, at least I could not find, the original context in which those words were spoken. So without further clarification, it's hard to know what he meant. But since these comments were not made in any official capacity as Pope or as part of the teaching of the Church, we are not bound to hold them. In 2003, the leadership of Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger and the direction of Pope John Paul II, in a document from the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, reminds us that we are to respect the dignity of persons who are experiencing homosexual attractions, as well as informing us how homosexual unions can be problematic and difficult for us and should not be supported. In fact, when asked about or with regards to support for such unions, in that document from the CDF, it said any politicians who support such things, such support itself would be gravely immoral. And so we see that the teaching of the Church is being upheld if we understand the proper context, at least for the first part of the quote of Pope Francis. The second part, a little more difficult to understand since we cannot find its proper original context. But we also know that the Church is one in her faith, that faith is continuous, and we are to hold that unity of faith that we have. And so let us take a moment to prepare ourselves for encountering the Lord in the Eucharist, being mindful of our unity in the one faith of the Catholic Church.